June 6, 1944. The Normandy coast was ablaze with chaos. Artillery fire thundered across the horizon, and the acrid smell of burnt metal and diesel fuel hung heavy in the air. Lieutenant James Mitchell stood in the turret of his M4 Sherman tank, scanning the landscape through a cloud of smoke. He was 29 years old, a career soldier from Ohio who had seen combat in North Africa, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold in the next 40 minutes. "Lieutenant, we're getting reports from forward observers," came the voice of Sergeant Harold Reeves through the intercom. Reeves was the radio operator, his job to maintain contact with command. His tone carried an edge of urgency that made Mitchell's jaw tighten. "Go ahead, Reeves. What are we dealing with?" "Sir, intelligence reports a German armored column moving through the valley, north-northeast of our position. They're estimating at least 15 Panzer IV tanks in formation. The report says they're pushing toward our supply lines, trying to break through our flanks." Mitchell felt the weight of that information settle on his shoulders. 15 Panzers. His single Sherman tank was outgunned in almost every measurable way. The Panzer IV had thicker armor, a more powerful gun and better protection for the crew. The Sherman was faster, more maneuverable, and there were more of them available to the Allies, but in a one-on-one fight, the mathematics were brutal. A Panzer IV's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from almost any angle at combat ranges. The Sherman's 75mm gun was less reliable against the German armor protection. "Reeves, get me a connection to Colonel Hastings. I need confirmation on that intel." The radio crackled. Then came the unmistakable voice of Colonel Richard Hastings, commander of the Armored Division. "Mitchell, you there? We need you to hold position at grid reference Baker 7-4. That column is moving fast, and if they break through, they'll cut our supply route to the beach. We don't have air support available right now. Ground forces are scattered. You're our best chance to slow them down." Mitchell processed the order. Slow them down, not stop them. Just slow them down. Because everyone knew what would happen if a single Sherman faced off against 15 Panzers in open terrain. The mathematics was simple. The outcome was almost certainly predetermined. But the objective wasn't victory. It was survival long enough to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. "Understood, Colonel. What's our time frame for additional support?" "Air support should be in the area within 45 minutes. Keep them engaged. Do whatever it takes." 45 minutes. But Mitchell had a feeling it was going to come down to something much tighter, much more immediate. He looked down into the turret at his crew. Corporal Frank Donovan was the gunner, a former mechanic from Detroit with steady hands and an almost supernatural ability to track moving targets. Private Tommy Chen was the loader, barely 21 years old, from San Francisco, fast and accurate. Private Robert Bobby Walsh was the driver, 23, from Boston. He had nerves of steel and could make that Sherman dance in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. "All right, everyone listen up. Command is sending us to hold a position northeast of here. We're going to have company soon. A German column, possibly 15 vehicles. I'm not going to lie to you. This situation is not ideal, but we've been trained for this. We're going to do our jobs. We're going to stay sharp, and we're going to do everything in our power to keep this machine and this crew intact." Any questions? Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Every man in that tank understood what was about to happen. They had all seen what a Panzer could do. They had all watched tanks burn. Mitchell opened the hatch fully and stood exposed in the turret, feeling the cool morning air on his face. In the distance, he could hear the rumble. Not thunder, not artillery. The distinctive diesel roar of heavy tank engines, multiple vehicles, all moving in formation. "Donovan, you hear that?" "I hear it, Lieutenant," came the reply from the gunner. "They're moving this way. Sounds like they're moving fast." "Reeves, get me constant updates on their position and distance. I want to know everything you can tell me." "Yes, sir. I'm monitoring the frequency now." Mitchell looked out across the terrain. They were positioned on a rise, which gave them some advantage. There was dense tree coverage to the north, and to the east, the land opened up into a wide valley. If the Germans came through that valley, the Sherman would have clear sight lines. But it also meant the Sherman would be completely exposed. He thought about the tank beneath him, this machine that had carried him through 3 campaigns now. The Sherman had never let him down. It was reliable, reasonably fast, and the crew had trained together long enough that they moved like a single organism. But reliability and training could only take you so far when you were facing overwhelming odds. All crew, this is Mitchell. We're moving to position Baker 7-4. Driver, move us northwest. Use the tree line for cover as much as possible. Take it smooth and steady. Gunner, traverse the turret and get ready. I want that gun tracking before we even come to a stop. We don't know the exact moment they're going to emerge, but when they do, reaction time is everything. Roger that, Lieutenant, Walsh replied from below. The tank lurched into motion, the engine rumbling louder as they picked up speed. Mitchell kept his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. The sound of the German column was growing louder, closer. He could hear individual vehicles now, not just a distant rumble, but the specific mechanical growl of Panzer engines. His mouth was dry. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was the moment. This was the test. "Contact, sir," came Reeves's voice. "They're approximately 4 kilometers out and closing, moving southeast through the valley. Estimated speed 12 kilometers per hour. Maintaining formation. 12 kilometers per hour." At that speed, they had less than 20 minutes before the column would reach their position. 20 minutes to prepare, 20 minutes to plan, 20 minutes to figure out how a single Sherman was going to slow down 15 Panzers without getting completely obliterated in the process. Mitchell looked down at his hands. They were steady. He had trained for this. He had prepared for this. But as he listened to the growing roar of the German engines and felt the vibration of his own tank's movement beneath his feet, one thought crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. Everything they did in the next 40 minutes would determine whether this crew lived or died. The Sherman rolled to a stop at position Baker 7-4 as dawn light continued to spread across the Norman landscape. Mitchell remained standing in the turret, scanning the distant tree line where the German column would emerge. But his mind was already working on a different problem, a problem that had been growing in the back of his consciousness since he arrived in Europe 3 weeks ago. He climbed down from the tank and walked along the starboard side, running his hand across the armor plating. The curved surface was marked with scorch patterns and deep gouges from near-miss artillery rounds. This tank had survived previous combat, but barely. Mitchell had been present at the engagement just 4 days earlier, about 20 kilometers south of their current position. A Sherman much like his own had faced a single Panzer before. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The Panzer's first round had struck the Sherman's front glacis plate at a steep angle and somehow penetrated, even though the mathematics said it shouldn't have been possible at that range. Mitchell had watched the crew bail out as flames began consuming the turret. He had helped carry 2 of them to the aid station. One of them, a young private from Nebraska named Stephen Cole, had lost both legs below the knee. The other, Sergeant Marcus Webb, survived with severe burns across 30% of his body. Mitchell had stood there in the field hospital tent, looking at what remained of those men, and he had made himself a promise. If he could figure out any advantage, any tactical edge, he would pursue it. "Lieutenant, you all right?" The voice pulled him back to the present. It was Corporal Frank Donovan, emerging from the turret. The gunner was wiping sweat and grease from his forehead with a rag. Donovan was 32, older than most enlisted men, and had worked as a diesel mechanic before the war. His mechanical mind and steady disposition made him an excellent gunner, but more importantly, he thought like an engineer. He understood how machines worked and why they failed. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about something," Mitchell said. "Frank, walk with me. I want to show you something." They moved to the front of the tank. Mitchell pointed to the glacis plate, the most heavily armored surface on the Sherman. "Remember that engagement near Liverpool last week? The Sherman that took that round from almost point-blank range?" Donovan nodded slowly. "The one that caught fire? Yeah. That round shouldn't have gotten through. Not at that angle. We ran the calculations afterward. The trajectory should have caused a ricochet." "That's what I thought too. But the angle of impact, Frank. Think about it. The Panzer's gun was positioned higher than our turret. The German gunner was firing downward at an angle. Our glacis plate is sloped, which is supposed to increase protection by deflecting rounds. But what if the angle of the incoming round actually worked with our armor design instead of against it? What if the combination of the gun's angle and our plate's slope created a convergence point? Donovan was quiet for a moment, studying the armor. You're suggesting that their gun angle counteracted our protection instead of adding to it? Exactly. What if we reverse the logic? What if we could use their angle against them? That's not possible, sir. The armor doesn't work that way. The design is optimized based on German tank capabilities. The engineers in Detroit have already done the calculations. I know what the engineers calculated, Mitchell said, but those calculations were made based on the assumption that the armor would be mounted and used in a specific way. What if we change that? Donovan looked at him carefully, and Mitchell could see the moment understanding began to dawn. You're talking about repositioning the armor? I'm talking about experimenting with repositioning the armor. Not in any permanent way. Just to test a theory. We know the Panzers are using a standard firing pattern. Their gunners are trained to aim for the glacis plate and the lower hull. They're expecting our armor to behave in a predictable manner. What if it didn't? Sir, if we modify the armor configuration and it doesn't work, we could expose critical areas. The tank could be vulnerable in ways that would be catastrophic. That would violate every design specification. If command found out, you could face serious charges. I'm aware of that, Mitchell said quietly, but I've also seen what happens when we do nothing. I've carried men to aid stations who were burned because we were relying on armor that performed exactly as designed against an enemy that was better at this game than we are. Donovan was silent. In the distance, they could still hear the low rumble of the German column, now perhaps 3 kilometers away and closing. We don't have much time, Mitchell continued. If you're going to think about this, you need to do it now. I need you to walk me through the mechanics. Could the armor be repositioned? Could we create a configuration where an incoming round would be deflected in a different way? Donovan took off his helmet and ran his hand through his hair. He was breathing heavily, thinking. The starboard side plate, he said finally. We could remove it. We have maybe 4 hours of daylight left, and that section would take about 40 minutes to fully detach if we work efficiently. The question is what we do with it. We can't just leave that section exposed. What if we reversed it? Flipped the angle of impact. The armor on a Panzer is angled one way. What if we angled our protection in the opposite direction? You mean install it inverted relative to the incoming threat, Donovan said slowly. So instead of a slope that the German gunner expects, they'd be shooting at a slope that mirrors their own approach angle. Theoretically, if the round hit that reversed surface, instead of burrowing forward, it might be deflected laterally or upward. Is it possible? Donovan looked at the tank, then back at Mitchell. It's possible. It's also completely against protocol. It would compromise the integrity of the whole design. If we did this and something went wrong, if the armor fractured or the weld points failed, we'd be worse off than if we'd left it alone. But if it works, Mitchell said, a Panzer round might not penetrate. If it works, Donovan echoed. He was staring at the armor, his mechanical mind working through the problem. Sir, there's another issue. Even if we could reconfigure the armor, we'd need to reinforce the internal mounting points. The brackets aren't designed to handle the stress of a reversed angle. We'd need to fabricate something, which means we'd need materials we don't have, and time we definitely don't have. What if we used what we have? The ammunition storage boxes, the spare parts containers. We could use those as bracing. Donovan turned to look at him. You've already thought this through, haven't you? I've been thinking about it since that Sherman caught fire. I just needed to understand the mechanics before I knew if it was actually viable. Even if we manage it, Donovan said, it's going to be considered a modification without authorization. If we survive this encounter, and if this trick works, there will be questions. Then we'll answer those questions, Mitchell said. Right now, I need to know if you think it will work, not if it's authorized, not if it's orthodox, just whether, from a mechanical standpoint, it's theoretically possible. Donovan looked back at the armor, at the scarred and dented surface that bore witness to every close call this tank had survived. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I think it's possible. It's crazy, but it's possible. Then we're going to try it. Get Chen and Walsh. We need to work fast. Every minute we waste is a minute closer to that column arriving. Can you do this without tearing the tank apart? We can try, Donovan said. He didn't sound confident, but he sounded committed. We're going to need tools. You'll have whatever you need, whatever's in this tank or in the supply depot over there. Tell me what you need, and I'll get it. Donovan nodded slowly. Then he looked directly at Mitchell. Sir, if this goes wrong, if that armor fails in combat, the Germans will tear through us like we're paper. I know, Mitchell said, but if we do nothing, they're going to tear through us anyway. At least this way, we're trying something. The two men stood there in the morning light, understanding the gravity of what they were about to attempt. In the distance, the rumble of German engines continued to grow louder, closer. The time frame was collapsing. But for the first time since receiving the order to hold position, Mitchell felt something shift in his mind. Not certainty. Uncertainty was still there, heavy and persistent. But purpose. A sense that they were going to do something, take some action, rather than simply wait for overwhelming odds to crush them. Let's get to work, Mitchell said. We're going to reverse their advantage. The work began immediately. Mitchell climbed back into the turret and issued rapid orders through the intercom. Chen, Walsh, I need you both topside, now. Donovan is going to direct the operation. Listen to everything he tells you and move fast. Within minutes, the 3 crew members were positioned around the starboard side of the tank. Donovan had already begun removing the access panels that covered the armor mounting points. He moved with the efficiency of someone who understood mechanical systems at a fundamental level. His hands working through procedures he had performed dozens of times during maintenance routines, but never with this particular objective in mind. All right, listen up, Donovan called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. We're going to disconnect the starboard glacis extension and reposition it. The mounting brackets need to be removed first. Tommy, I need you on that upper bolt. Bobby, you take the lower mounting points. Watch for tension in the bolts. If one of them seizes up, we stop and work it loose carefully. We don't have time for stripped threads or broken equipment. Private Tommy Chen, the loader, was 21 years old and possessed the kind of physical agility that made him ideal for climbing across tank armor. His hands moved quickly, working the wrench against the corroded bolts. Private Robert Walsh, the driver, was working the lower section, his broader frame making the work slightly more difficult, but his determination was evident in every movement. How long is this going to take? Mitchell asked, checking his watch. The time was now 09:35. The German column, according to the last radio report from Reeves, was approximately 2 kilometers away and continuing to advance. 20 minutes to disconnect, Donovan said, not looking up from his work. Maybe 30 if those bolts don't cooperate. Then we need to figure out the mounting configuration for the reversal. That's going to be the tricky part. The bolts, fortunately, cooperated. The armor was designed to be field replaceable, which meant that the fasteners, while corroded from exposure to sea air and dust, were not seized solid. By 09:58, the starboard glacis extension was hanging loose, supported only by the final connection point at the lower hull. Donovan wiped sweat from his forehead and stood back, studying the panel. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. We can't install this panel inverted without reinforcement. The stress vectors would be wrong, but we can rotate it, create an angle that's reversed relative to how it's normally positioned. Instead of the slope directing incoming rounds forward and down into the tank, we angle it so incoming rounds would be deflected laterally or upward. How do we reinforce it? Mitchell asked. We use what we have, Donovan said. I've been looking at the ammunition storage boxes and the spare parts containers. If we weld or bolt some of these together behind the panel, we create a support structure that wasn't part of the original design. It's not ideal, but it should work. They began carrying supplies from inside the tank, ammunition boxes that had been emptied during preparations for the position, steel containers, spare track sections, anything with structural rigidity. Donovan and Walsh began positioning these materials, while Chen continued working on the technical connections. By 10:22, the reinforcement structure was in place. Now came the moment where theory met practical application. The armor panel had to be reinstalled, but at a different angle. Donovan had calculated that a 45-degree reverse rotation would create the deflection angle he was looking for, but the new mounting configuration would need to be precise. Help me get this back into position, Donovan called. Mitchell, Walsh and Chen worked together to lift the heavy panel and begin threading it back through the connection points. The work was physically demanding and time-consuming. Every movement had to be deliberate. A dropped panel could damage the tank. A mistake in alignment could render the entire effort useless. By 10:51, the panel was back in place, but not secured. Donovan walked around it, measuring angles with a piece of string and comparing them to marks he had made on the armor. "That's close," he muttered. "Real close. But we need it shifted about 2 centimeters to starboard and maybe 1 centimeter lower. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Mitchell looked toward the north. In the distance, he could hear the German engines more clearly now. They were getting closer. The time frame was collapsing. "We're running out of time," Mitchell said quietly. "I know," Donovan replied. He didn't sound stressed. He sounded focused. "Give me 3 more minutes to get this angle dialed in, and then we lock it down. After that, we test it." Those 3 minutes felt like 30. But Donovan adjusted the panel twice more, measuring each time with meticulous care. When he was satisfied with the positioning, he nodded at Walsh and Chen. "Bolts. Tight, but not so tight that you strip them. We need this secure but not permanent. If this works, Command is going to want to examine exactly what we did." The bolts went in, one by one. By 11:20, the armor panel was secured in its new configuration. "Now we test it," Donovan said. He looked at Mitchell. "Sir, we need to fire the machine gun at this panel at close range. I need to see how the rounds behave when they impact at this angle." "Do it," Mitchell said. Donovan moved to the hull and positioned himself with the coaxial machine gun mounted next to the main cannon. The gun was primarily intended for targets too small or close for the main armament, but in this case, it was going to serve a different purpose. He aimed at the newly repositioned armor panel from a distance of approximately 15 meters and fired a short burst. The rounds struck the armor in a tight cluster. For a moment, nothing seemed different. But then Donovan repositioned the gun and fired again from a different angle. This time Mitchell saw it. One of the rounds didn't burrow into the panel. It deflected. The trajectory changed. The round glanced off at an angle and went careening into the dirt beyond the tank. "It works," Donovan said, lowering the gun. There was a note of surprise in his voice, as if even he hadn't been entirely certain until he saw the evidence with his own eyes. "The angle is working. At close range with rifle-caliber rounds, we're seeing deflection instead of penetration." "What about against a Panzer round?" Walsh asked. "Different ballistic characteristics," Donovan said. "A rifle round is lighter, travels faster, loses velocity quicker. An armor-piercing round from a Panzer gun is heavier, maintains velocity better, and has more kinetic energy. But the principle should hold. If a rifle round deflects off this configuration, there's a chance a heavier round might do the same, or at least be deflected enough to reduce penetration." Mitchell checked his watch. 11:43. The German column was now less than a kilometer away. They had accomplished what they set out to do, but there was no time for additional testing or refinement. "Everyone back inside the tank," Mitchell ordered. "Secure everything that's loose. We go to action stations now." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, dropping back into their positions. Donovan moved to the gunner's seat. Chen took his position as loader. Walsh settled into the driver's compartment. Mitchell remained in the turret, his eyes fixed on the northern tree line. In the radio set, Reeves came back online with his final report before the engagement. "Contact is imminent, sir. German column now approximately 600 meters away. I count 15 distinct vehicle positions. They're maintaining formation." Mitchell took a breath. Everything they had done in the last hour and 17 minutes came down to what was about to happen. The armor had been repositioned according to Donovan's calculations. The configuration had been tested. It showed promise. But theory and practice were not always the same thing. In actual combat, against an enemy with superior training and superior equipment, promise was not the same as certainty. "All crew, this is Mitchell," he said through the intercom. "This is it. Stay focused, stay sharp, do your jobs. We've done everything we can to prepare. Now we execute." The Sherman's engine rumbled. The German column continued its advance through the trees. In approximately 90 seconds, they would have visual contact. In approximately 2 minutes, the first shots would be fired. And for the first time in his military career, Lieutenant James Mitchell was going into combat with equipment that had never been tested in actual battle conditions, with a configuration that violated every protocol his commanders had laid out, and with nothing but faith in his crew and a desperate hope that a reversed armor angle might actually make a difference. The German column emerged from the tree line at 0:11:52. Mitchell watched through the periscope as the first Panzer IV appeared, followed by another, then another. The German commander had maintained formation discipline through the advance, which meant they were expecting organized resistance. What they were not expecting was what they were about to encounter. "Range," Mitchell called to Donovan. 800 meters and closing," the gunner replied. "I have the lead vehicle in my sights." "Hold fire until they're at 600, Mitchell ordered. "Let them come to us." The German column continued advancing. Mitchell could see the turrets beginning to traverse, searching for the Sherman. They knew there was an Allied tank in the area. Their scouts had probably spotted the position earlier. But they were advancing with the confidence of an army that had superior firepower and experience. At 650 meters, the German lead tank fired. The round came in fast and struck the front glacis plate. The impact was tremendous, a sound like a hammer striking an anvil amplified 1,000 times over. But it did not penetrate. The round struck at an angle, encountered the reversed armor configuration and deflected upward, passing over the tank and crashing into the ridge behind them. "First round deflected," Donovan reported, his voice steady. "They didn't penetrate." "Fire," Mitchell commanded. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. At this range, accuracy was excellent. The round struck the German tank's turret, not a killing blow but a solid hit that would degrade their targeting system. The German tank slowed, its commander likely assessing the damage. 2 more Panzer rounds came in rapid succession. The first struck lower on the tank, below the reversed armor section. Mitchell felt the impact resonate through the entire structure, but there was no explosion, no sudden intake of smoke indicating a catastrophic hit. The second round struck even higher, grazing the top of the turret. Again, deflection. Again, the armor held. "They're adjusting aim," Donovan observed. "The German gunner is figuring out that the standard impact points aren't working. He's shifting his targeting." The next round came from a different Panzer coming around the left flank. This shot was aimed directly at the reversed armor section. It struck with tremendous force, and for a terrible moment Mitchell thought the entire configuration was going to fail. But Donovan's reinforcement structure held. The round struck the angled surface and glanced off, throwing sparks, but not penetrating. 4 rounds fired, 4 rounds deflected. But the Germans were not panicking. They were adapting. "They're shifting positions," Mitchell said, watching the German column begin to spread out. Instead of maintaining the linear formation, the Panzers were beginning to maneuver, attempting to bracket the Sherman from multiple angles. 5 more rounds came in, each from a different tank, each aimed at different sections of the Sherman's armor. Some struck the reversed glacis section and deflected. Others struck different armor plates. One round struck the lower hull and actually penetrated slightly, but the penetration was shallow, glancing. The reinforcement structure inside absorbed the impact energy. "Ninth round," Chen called out, watching the strike pattern. The loader was tracking the impacts, counting them. "We're holding." But holding was not the same as being unhurt. Mitchell could feel each impact through the entire tank. The crew was being thrown around in their seats. Equipment was shifting. A coffee can fell from one of the shelves and clattered against the floor. Through the periscope, Mitchell could see smoke beginning to rise from the German positions. "We're hitting them too," Walsh reported from the driver's compartment. "That first tank we shot at is withdrawing. I can see damage to the turret ring. The gunner's probably having trouble tracking." The German column was beginning to fragment. Instead of a coordinated assault, the individual tanks were now maneuvering independently, each trying to find a firing angle that would work. But the reversed armor configuration was proving to be a consistent problem. Their standard tactics, refined through years of combat against other tanks, were not effective against this unexpected modification. 10 rounds had been fired at the Sherman. 10 rounds had failed to achieve penetration. But the Germans were nothing if not persistent. The Panzer crews were experienced soldiers. They began to shift their approach. 2 tanks moved to higher ground, attempting to fire from elevated positions where the angle of attack would be different. 3 others maneuvered toward the left flank where the armor was less heavily modified. "Incoming from the left," Donovan warned. "Elevated position. That round is going to hit the side armor." The round struck the port side of the tank, hitting an area that had not been modified. It penetrated partially, and Mitchell heard metal screaming as the round tore through the interior compartment. Equipment shattered. A small fire erupted near the ammunition storage. "Get that fire out," Mitchell commanded. Chen was already moving, grabbing the extinguisher and directing foam toward the source. The fire went out, but the damage was done. They had sustained a hit that penetrated the armor. 11 rounds. One had gotten through. But the tank was still operational. The engine still rumbled. The gun still fired. And now the German commanders were beginning to realize that this engagement was not going according to their expectations. They had expected overwhelming superiority to translate into quick victory. Instead, they were facing an opponent that was absorbing punishment that should have destroyed it. 12 rounds fired, Walsh called out. Another impact, this time striking the glacis plate again. The reinforced angle held again. Deflection. No penetration. The German formation was becoming disorganized. They had come expecting to push through Allied defenses quickly and cut supply lines. Instead, they were engaged in a prolonged firefight with a single tank that refused to die. Their command structure was beginning to fragment. Individual tank commanders were making independent decisions instead of executing coordinated tactics. 13 rounds, Chen reported. Still holding. Mitchell checked his watch. The engagement had been ongoing for approximately 4 minutes. Reinforcements had been promised. But 4 minutes in combat felt like an eternity. 4 minutes was enough time for everything to go wrong, for the tank to be surrounded, for the crew to be overrun. But it was also enough time for something else to happen. In the distance, Mitchell heard a new sound. Not German tank engines. Aircraft engines, multiple aircraft, approaching from the south. "We've got air support inbound," Reeves called through the radio, his voice carrying genuine relief. "American Thunderbolts approximately 2 minutes out. German command is being informed. They're pulling back." But the Germans were not pulling back yet. 2 more rounds came in, 14 and 15. The 14th struck the reversed armor again. Deflection. The 15th struck the lower hull, but failed to penetrate deeply, the kinetic energy absorbed by the structure. 15 rounds. 15 impacts. And the Sherman was still there, still fighting, still intact. The German column commander, seeing the American fighter aircraft approaching and recognizing that his tactical advantage had evaporated, made the decision to withdraw. The Panzers began reversing, pulling back toward the tree line. The engagement that had begun with overwhelming German superiority had ended in strategic stalemate. As the German tanks disappeared back into the forest, Mitchell allowed himself to breathe. The crew was silent, each man processing what had just happened. They had faced 15 Panzer rounds. 14 had been defeated by Donovan's reversed armor configuration. One had penetrated an unmodified section, but the damage had been manageable. They had survived an encounter that should have ended with the crew bailing out and the tank burning. The American Thunderbolts screamed overhead, their guns blazing at the retreating German column. Mitchell watched from the turret as one of the trailing Panzer tanks took multiple rounds and erupted into flame. The remaining German vehicles accelerated toward the tree line, abandoning the engagement. "All crew damage report," Mitchell commanded through the intercom. "Engine still running," Walsh reported from the driver's compartment. "We've got some vibration in the transmission, but nothing critical. Navigation systems are intact." "Turret traverse is sluggish," Donovan added. "That round that came through the side damaged something in the mechanical system, but the gun still rotates. I can work with it." "Fire suppression is complete," Chen said. "We've got some compartment damage, some equipment destruction, but the core systems are still operational." Mitchell nodded slowly. They had taken one penetrating hit, and it had caused damage, but nothing catastrophic. The reversed armor configuration had worked exactly as Donovan had theorized. 14 rounds had been defeated. One had penetrated, but the tank had absorbed it and remained functional. "Colonel Hastings is requesting a status report," Reeves called from the radio compartment. "German column is retreating. They're asking if we need immediate support." "Tell the colonel we're operational," Mitchell replied. "Request permission to hold this position and await further orders." What followed was silence, and then hours later a visitor. Colonel Richard Hastings arrived at the position at approximately 1700 hours in a jeep. He was a career officer in his mid-50s, a veteran of the previous war, and a man who had seen enough combat to understand both its necessities and its protocols. He walked directly to the Sherman and studied it carefully, examining the damage patterns and the armor configuration. "Your tank looks like it's been through hell," Hastings said, addressing Mitchell directly. "We engaged the German column as ordered, sir," Mitchell replied. "They attempted to break through our position. The engagement lasted approximately 4 minutes. We sustained one penetrating hit, but the tank remains operational." Hastings continued his inspection, running his hand along the armor plating. His eyes lingered on the reversed glacis section, studying the angle and the reinforcement structure that was clearly visible. "I'm going to need a detailed report on this," Hastings said. "Specifically, I need to know exactly what you did to this tank and why." Mitchell chose his words carefully. "Sir, we made a tactical modification based on observations from previous engagements. The modification involved reconfiguring the starboard armor section to create a different deflection angle for incoming rounds." "Without authorization," Hastings said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir, without authorization." Hastings was quiet for a long moment. "And this modification was effective?" 14 out of 15 German rounds were deflected, sir. 1 penetrated an unmodified section. The tank and crew remained intact." The colonel nodded slowly. "Write it up. I want documentation of exactly what was done, how it was done and the results. Send it through proper channels." Mitchell wrote the report that evening. It was detailed and technical, documenting every aspect of Donovan's modification, every calculation, every test. He submitted it through the official command structure. The report disappeared, not literally. It was filed and acknowledged. But it never circulated beyond the immediate command level. There were no follow-up inquiries, no requests for additional information, no orders to inspect the tank or interview the crew. The modification had been too irregular, too outside standard protocols. The armor reconfiguration violated design specifications. The use of improvised reinforcement materials was unsanctioned. The entire approach was, from a regulatory standpoint, problematic. But what happened next was more interesting than any official acknowledgement could have been. Over the next 3 weeks, other tank commanders began requesting information about the reversed armor configuration. Donovan received visits from other mechanics wanting to understand the technical details. Other crews began attempting similar modifications on their own vehicles, not openly, not as official policy, but as an informal practice, spreading through the tank corps like whispered knowledge passed between soldiers. By mid-July, approximately 30 Sherman tanks had been modified using variations of Donovan's original design. Some versions were more refined than others. Some incorporated Donovan's original reinforcement strategy. Others developed their own approaches to creating the reversed deflection angle. But the core principle remained the same. Mitchell tracked the casualty reports for modified tanks versus unmodified tanks. The numbers were difficult to isolate perfectly, but the trend was clear. Modified tanks were surviving engagements that had previously been catastrophic. Crew survival rates improved, tank losses decreased. The effect was subtle but measurable. In August, Mitchell was reassigned to a division staff position. Before he left, Donovan pulled him aside. "Sir, I wanted you to know. I've been training other mechanics on the modification. It's spreading faster than command realizes. They're not stopping it because they can't stop it without admitting it works." "How many tanks do you think have been modified?" Mitchell asked. "Last count I heard, it's over 150 now, maybe more. Different versions, different refinements, but all based on the principle we discovered. And the casualty reduction is real, sir, I know it is." Mitchell left Europe in November, returning to the United States for staff training. The war continued for another 6 months after that. When the final casualty statistics were compiled after the German surrender, the analysts struggled to quantify the impact of the modified armor configuration. The tank corps had never officially acknowledged the modification as policy. It existed in a gray area, neither forbidden nor endorsed, simply present. But when researchers later examined tank crew survival rates between units that had widely adopted the modification and units that had not, the differences were significant. Conservative estimates suggested that the tactic had reduced crew deaths by approximately 12 to 15% in affected units. In raw numbers, That translated to somewhere between 800 and 1,200 lives saved. Young men who had survived combat and returned home because their tanks had absorbed punishment that should have been catastrophic. Years after the war, when military journals began publishing technical analysis of armor configurations and deflection mechanics, Donovan's original insight appeared in academic papers. The reversed angle deflection theory became recognized as a legitimate principle in armor design. Modern tank armor would eventually incorporate many of these same principles, refined and formalized through decades of additional research. But none of that happened immediately. In the moment, in June of 1944, what Mitchell and Donovan had accomplished was simple. They had identified a problem. They had proposed a solution that violated protocol. They had tested it under pressure. And when the time came to execute, they had made it work. Mitchell retired from the Army in 1962 after 2 decades of service. He was invited to speak at armor symposiums and technical conferences, but he rarely discussed the tank modification. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he understood the bigger picture. The modification had worked not because of genius or brilliance, but because a crew had refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. Because a gunner with mechanical understanding had been willing to question established doctrine. Because a team of soldiers had chosen to try something unconventional rather than simply wait for overwhelming odds to crush them. That, Mitchell understood, was the real legacy. Not the armor configuration itself, not even the lives that had been saved because of it, but the principle that innovation under pressure, born from necessity and executed with discipline, could change the outcome of battles and the course of history. In the end, that was what the reversed armor trick had truly proven.